Thanks, Adam. That was also fabulous. Ursula?
Well, I owe so much to Leo, personally and intellectually, and to Melanie, I may say that. I'm not even going to try and tell you about it. It would take up more than the 15 minutes that I've been allotted here today. So just take it as given, you know, it's helped to transform my life in various ways. But I do want to take as my starting point today one of the many things that I learned from Leo, and that is the complexity of the relationship between the state and global capitalism, and the way in which they both collude and contradict each other. The constant process of mutual adaptation and tension, and the tension between the different roles of social reproduction, of disciplining the workforce, and so on. This kind of dance that goes on continuously and continuously evolves between the state and global capitalism, and the relationship between that and the working class, which is very complex, not least at the practical level. You know, it's like, as a member of the working class, where do you put your energy? Which meeting do you go to? You know, are you more interested in fighting Amazon, you know, or fighting the Tories, or whatever it is? This dilemma has become more and more extreme over the period, the rise of neoliberalism and the rise of globalization, and it has presented us with some huge problems. And I think in thinking about how to address those problems, which in the UK right now is very much a live question, because we are suddenly confronted with this possibility that there may actually be a Labour government that's going to hit the ground running. We're thinking about this question a lot, and in those discussions there's a lot of harking back. There's a lot of harking back to that moment after World War II in the mid-20th century, those optimistic times in which welfare states were forged, and it looked as if everybody was around the same table on some level. And I think it's very dangerous to be romantic about that post-war deal, special period, the golden years, the trente glorieuses, whatever you want to call it, that period. Because in many ways it was pretty horrible, actually. It was horrible if you were black. It was horrible if you were gay. It was horrible if you had the misfortune to get pregnant when you weren't married. It was, you know, horrible in all sorts of ways. And the movements of the 60s that we were celebrating yesterday, which was when the first products of that welfare state hit the universities, certainly in the UK. These were working class kids entering universities in which the entrenched power of the traditional elites were there. And there were kids who were confident enough to say, you know, let's change this. But you know, that movement came in reaction to a lot of things that were pretty horrible about the way the 1950s and early 60s welfare states were run. So let's not romanticize it. But on the other hand, it did have some ingredients that I think we can sort of learn something from. In particularly, because my perspective a little bit unlike, I suspect a lot of people in this room. Most of my history was from the let's fight capitalism side of the story rather than the let's fight Tory state side of the story. So from my perspective, one of the characteristics of that period was that the trade unions who represented the organised working class, well, you know, it was quite a small portion of the working class because it excluded most women, it excluded most immigrant workers, it excluded a lot of low-paid workers. But nevertheless, the trade unions and the social democratic parties were able to sit down and negotiate deals that were for the whole working class, not sectional interests for particular groups of workers, but deals that covered the whole working class. Health services, pensions, you know, child benefits, universal demands that benefited everybody. And it was possible to do that, in my opinion, partly, I mean, there were all sorts of things like, you know, the Cold War and capital being prepared to make concessions to Labour to stop it going communist. There were all kinds of contingent features of that particular period. But it was also partly to do with the fact that the reserve army of Labour was largely national. It wasn't completely national, it was largely national. And in the UK, the unemployed or the people in awful casual jobs, they'd been to the same schools as the organised revenue. They'd done national service together in the army. You queued up and had your kids vaccinated in the same public clinics. And it was possible, out of that sense of the communal, which still exists actually in parts of Sweden and so on, you still get that sense of everybody belonging to the same community. It was possible out of that to come a politics which now, in retrospective, looks ridiculously idealistic, like this idea of sisterhood in the women's movement. People think now, how could these bourgeois women who've been to university feel a sisterhood with sex workers? Oh, come on, you know. Well, in fact, you know, if your kids went to the same schools, you went to the same clinic, and these were your neighbours, you lived on the same council estates, possibly, you know, that was a real possibility. Now we have got globalisation, and sex workers are trafficked in from the other side of the world, and the thought of that kind of a solidarity is impossible to imagine. But I think this coexistence of the reserve army and the organised labour with the social democratic parties around a table in which these institutional forms were developed, which still exist in some European countries in some sort of form. Like in the UK, we had the National Economic Development Council, which was kind of an institutional way for employers' organisations, which by and large did represent national employers in a period when relatively few, I mean, of course there were transnational corporations, but there was a lot of national capital. And trade unions represented the majority of workers. And so there was a real sense in which deals were being hammered out at a national level that produced a welfare state. What we have, you know, fast track forward, not only do we have a global reserve army, which is accessed both through migration and through offshoring of jobs, and a complete breakdown of those solidarities, which have a real practical consequence. Because by negotiating a deal that protects the reserve army, gives them a subsistence income, gives them certain rights, you're guaranteeing the fact that they're not going to scab when you're on strike. They're not going to cross your picket line. You know, these solidarities have a real meaning for Labour. But in the meanwhile, not only has that sort of geographical unity, you might say, or commonality between reserve army, because even recently arrived immigrants were absorbed into those communities to an extent during this period. But we also have had, under neoliberalism, under globalisation, the character of those welfare states that were created to protect workers, for there to be no going back to the awfulness of the 1930s that people remembered in that post-war period. They have been turned into the opposites of what they were intended to be. Welfare states now, the British welfare state, or the carcass of what it once was, is now used as an instrument for channeling money to capital. The housing benefit is paying money, it's ostensibly going to poor people, it's not, it's going straight to private landlords. Tax credits are a way of subsidising employers who pay below subsistence wages. Neoliberal welfare policies actually, and of course, outsourcing and privatisation of public services is turning what was a field of the generation of use values in a solidaristic way within communities, just turning it into a field of accumulation for transnational corporations. Meanwhile, the powers that the nation state still to some extent had, depending on what state it was and so on, the power to extract taxes, the power to break up monopolies, all these powers have been lost. I mean, some supranational organisations like the European Commission make feeble attempts. you know, to make Microsoft play some tax or whatever. But, you know, basically, that's all gone. So the welfare state has just become an instrument for, you know, building capital at the expense of workers very directly. And meanwhile, the social protection system, the social security system, it's become like the 19th century workhouse, only worse. Because in the workhouse, you've got a roof over your head, you've got a bowl of gruel. You know, I mean, families were separated, it was awful. But the welfare system in the UK right now uses a sanctions regime, which is so penal. People lose their benefit for turning up 2 days late, 2 minutes late for an appointment, for being in hospital having chemotherapy, so they can't attend their appointment. People, when they're dead, you know, it happened to the daughter of a friend of mine. Her mother was fine because she'd actually died in hospital and couldn't meet her appointment because she wasn't alive anymore. You know? So on the one hand, you've got these incredible punishments of the unemployed, and the public sector workers who work in the job centres are given targets. They are punished if they don't sanction enough people. They're given weekly and monthly targets of how many people they have to sanction. It's that penal, it's that vicious and cruel, this system. So on the one hand, you've got these incredible penalties, the punishment of the unemployed. On the other hand, the jobs that are created below subsistence rates are subsidised. Effectively the employers subsidise through the tax credit system. So, yes, I know, I'm getting there. So, I mean, that's the pessimism, we've got to overcome that. Right, now to the optimism. We really do have reason for optimism, because something extraordinary is happening in the UK right now. Very, very fractured and dispersed. Because not only we've got what I think Hillary was talking about, this surge of young people into the Labour Party, which is now the biggest political party in Europe, largely thanks to these young kids who fill football stadiums, you know, cheering for Corbyn. But I have to say, most of them don't even know what a trade union is. You know, let's be realistic about it. But also, out there in the fight against capitalism, that something that hasn't happened since the 1880s is happening. New trade unions are forming. The IWGB, International Workers of Great Britain, who are organising outsourced cleaning workers, have had 3 successful strikes. The United Private Hire Drivers, who are organising Uber drivers. The GMB, McDonald's workers are on strike, who have been in the last couple of weeks. Suddenly, after a period when I mean, I've often thought that there's nobody under the age of 50 in the UK who remembers what it's like to win, you know. And this is one of the reasons why people get so disillusioned with trade unions and things, because they've forgotten what it's like to win and then move on to the next victory, because there's been defeat after defeat after defeat. And suddenly these kids are, not only are they organising, but they're winning stuff. And this is really exciting. But what the project that faces us is we have to completely rebuild. We have to design a new kind of welfare state. And it has to be fought for, it seems to me. We have to find a programme that brings together 3 very, very different constituencies. And one is these momentum kids, you know, flocking into the Labour Party. One is these unorganised workers who are organising, really organising, like these Uber drivers and so on. And the third is the traditional trade union members, many of whose members are very cynical. They don't want their union contributions to be used to organise these immigrant workers who haven't been paying their dues. You know, there's some big bridges to be built, but who have resiliently hung on in there for the last 40 years through defeat after defeat after defeat. So they're very admirable in a way, the organised trade union members. But these 3 very different constituencies have to be brought together around a common programme. I haven't got time to tell you what that common programme is, but I've got some really nice bullet points that I at some point will give you, mainly as a result of talking to a lot of these gig economy workers, finding out what they really want. But anyway, I'll shut up there because I think my time's up. Thank you.